So in this video, I'm going to talk about how I structure and teach Photo One. So I start with backwards design. I'm turning these students into photographers. What do they need to know and be able to do to become photographers? And more than that, how can I teach them to see the world the way that photographers do, which is a little different than the way normal people do? I have a couple of documents that I'm going to show in this video, and I will link them in the description. So, kind of overall, I have some different areas that I teach during the week, or they're basically in like 2 week. Well, previously they were in kind of 2 week units. Now I have some weekly units, but I'll explain why later. But I am teaching them several different things. I've got kind of essential questions. What are the big ideas? And I've cut those into little pieces, kind of chunks that are taught each unit and build upon each other. I have some photography and camera skills. So that would be composition and technical skills of how to use their cameras. There's also digital skills. We do Photoshop during the class. And those, again, are cut into chunks. And I teach them a couple skills. They do an assignment to show that they have learned those skills. And then the next unit where we do that, they learn some more skills and they have to use those previous skills and the new skills and demonstrate that they know, that they understand and know how to use those tools. And then there's kind of photographic concepts. So in the beginning, I teach them about this term I came up with called active choices, which is, photographers, hey, we just press a button, right? We're not doing all the stuff that painters and drawers and sculptors do. We kind of just press a button. That's what people like to say about photographers. But we make all of these choices in our heads. And so I introduce that to the students and the idea of active choices. So they become kind of more mindful in the way they look at the world. And then the next unit is light and shadows, because everybody notices light and shadows, but photographers think of light and shadows in a different kind of way. So that's the next thing that we do. And then building on that is those principles and elements of design or visual organization, as Dr. Paul Sproul calls them, which I think is a great, he was at RISD, he retired recently. I think that's a great way to talk about the principles and elements of design, because it is the way that you are organizing everything visually in the rectangle. And uh, so we look at those things so that students start noticing those in their environment and decide to include them into their photos. Then, and only then, so once they've started thinking and looking like a photographer, then we go to camera controls. Then we learn shutter speed and aperture. Um, and then after that, they do portraits. So that's actually starting to think about, hey, how can I use these skills I've learned before? How can I use shallow depth of field, and why would I want to use it this way? How can I incorporate line and shape and texture? How can I do all these things to try and get mood or emotion across? So now we've gone from just kind of the more kind of dry functional things to try and communicate through our photos. So they actually have to take two portraits of the same person, but they have to make very different active choices in both of the images, so you get a different kind of motion or mood across in both images. And then we go into aesthetics. So the philosophy of art and beauty, and have them start looking like, well, can I take pictures of quote unquote ugly things, but in a beautiful way, using all of these skills that I've learned in the first 5 units? Um, and then on to that is diptych and sequence. So again, building in terms of conceptually, how can I take photographs of two different things and combine them together and make them better and more interesting than they were, and have them say something more than an image by itself? And then we go into color. And honestly, I could have done color a lot earlier, but it's just kind of nice at this point in the year to give them a little bit of a break. have them learn some color theory, but that also ties into mood and emotion and expressing themselves, which is totally appropriate, I think, for, this second half of Photo 1 education. And then we go into more like conceptual photography. So I've done different things at different times. I used to have them pick two sound words, and so they would have to photograph something that looked the way the sound sounded. I do something kind of differently now. I'll show that in a moment. And then we go into commercial photography. So we've talked about fine art photography basically the whole semester, and now we talk about the different ways that people take photos, working for clients, making money. Yeah. And then in the end, they do basically a mini concentration. So each one of them decides on an idea, and that's what they photograph for themselves. So every student in the class is photographing something different. It's almost like a mini AP or theme or old concentration in the way the AP tested it. But again, that's generated from the student themselves, and they get to make it as concrete or conceptual, as personal or visual as they like. But it allows them to have some agency and some choice kind of in the class. Now, in terms of choice, I always give a kind of the major ideas, shadow and light, for example, but I never tell them exactly what to photograph. They go and photograph whatever it is that they like. This is kind of with the whole everything that's been happening with COVID. I turned it into a more structured kind of week by week um, plan. And this also will be in the comments. I mean, not in the comments, in the description for this video. But it basically goes along with I have some extra little honors assignments that are in there because these are week by week instead of 2 weeks for the units. But I'll explain that in a second. But anyway, uh, now I don't even remember what I was saying. But so just like those concepts build, so I introduce those concepts, and then the students do things to support those concepts, like they we talk about active choices. I do a little mini lecture, and then we look online and find some photographs, and the students talk to each other and talk to the class about images and those active choices in those images. They do some research, with shadows and light. We talk about bad and good examples. I show them some past work. We talk about editing to enhance shadows and light in Lightroom, and then they have some time to try that out, and those kind of things. So there's always things in class, like even when we learn visual organization, they actually go onto some websites where there's a lot of photography work, and they have to find an example for line and find an example for shape and for positive and negative space. And that works for two reasons. One, if they can identify it in other people's work, maybe they can help them identify it out in the world. But two, it gets them looking at a lot of really good photographers' work. So yeah, so there's always things that they do that back up in class the ideas that we've talked about. And all of my students take their pictures at home. I've been teaching for 18 years. I've taught at several places where I was replacing someone who had let students just wander around and take pictures during class, which is very unpopular with other teachers and administration. Plus, you just get a million pictures of like schools, and it's super boring. So I think that they have much more fun and they can express themselves more if they take their pictures at home. Some people have said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't think that they would take them. I think their motivation would be low." I would argue that their motivation is actually higher when they have cool, interesting things to photograph that are part of their own lives instead of hallways and lockers. I know that's their life, but that's like the most boring part of their life. So, plus, you get many more images that are like you could actually use to send into Scholastic. You could actually use to send into Congressional Art Awards or to AP or whatever, because they're interesting pictures of their homes, of their outside, of their cities, of their lives, of their friends, instead of just like the same boring hallways over and over again. So I have not really had problems with motivation with that, especially now since COVID, I do have all of my students just use their cell phones. And it is so much easier. My Photo 1 students, my upper level, my Photo 2, and my AP students use cameras. But my Photo 1 students, the fact that they can take pictures on their phones, edit on their phones with Lightroom Mobile, and upload to, our LMS. So we use Google Classroom, you might use Canvas or something else, just streamlines it and actually makes that compliance and that turning in photos on time way easier, because they don't have to like deal with bringing their cameras to school or their memory cards and then they forget it and whatever. So plus this is the camera that they have on them all the time. They should know how to use it. So, in terms of Photoshop, the way I structure it is that, how do I structure it? I structure it in little pieces. So, the first things are just kind of like, hey, cutting and pasting, transform layers, all that kind of stuff. And then they do like a Photoshop where they have to have a cat or a dog and all this goofy stuff going on. Um, and then we talk about like other things, removing red eye and stuff, using the cropping tool. Then they do hand color. So that's layer blending modes, paintbrush, layer mask, stuff like that. And that's just taking a picture, making it black and white, and then adding colors on top that you see through. And then they learn the fixing tools when they do portraits. And so the patch tool, cloning stamp, that kind of things, removing scars and stuff, making people look like they do on their best day. Um, and then they do the dream Photoshop. These are all really goofy Photoshop things, but it just, again, they learn a little chunk of Photoshop at a time. And then they do an assignment to demonstrate that they can do those things. So that's filters, layer styles, clipping masks, super cheesy. But I tell them, hey, you're using them in a cheesy way, but just think in the future you have these skills and you can use them in a much more kind of nuanced, interesting way to get ideas across in your work. And we talk about why things aren't working in Photoshop, whatever. So they have their shooting assignment. So this is similar to the document I showed before, the curriculum, but I teach both honors and CP students at the same time. So everybody learns the same curriculum, but honor students turn in photos every week, and uh, college prep students turn in photos every other week. So they do all the major assignments that were on that first curriculum. I do kind of randomly put in some kind of like, I don't know, just more project-y assignments for my honors kids to do. Everybody learns about it. Everybody learns about, say, like reflections or focal points or abstract photos, but it's only the honor students that need to shoot those. So that's why I said before that I had 2 week units, but here they're kind of week by week. So shutter and aperture and abstracts is kind of the same unit, but it's just that the honor students shoot 2 photos during that time. And then there's other things that we do in class. We might watch some videos, we might watch some documentaries, primary sources, photographers talking about themselves, like Annie Leibovitz during the portrait unit. We'll look at things like, what's the difference between fine art photographs and snapshots, or doing some critiquing, talking about culling and editing and picking which photos are the best ones to use, going over some of the concepts. They make Cahoots, that kind of stuff. What else? They do a project on photographers themselves and do some presentations. Usually I make only the honor students give the presentations, but I make everybody make a presentation. Some Wiggins creativity rubric, doing self-reflection, that kind of stuff. So again, they're taking their photos outside of class, while inside of class, they're doing all these other things, the class activities to support the concepts, Photoshop, The other things that we're learning about, the importance of photography in politics and society, and issues of ethics in photography, and all of those kind of things, discussions and whatever, and of course critiques. And that's what kind of fills up our 3 to 4 class periods per week in school. So I hope that this has been helpful. I have videos on my YouTube that explain all these ideas. So if you say, well, what is active choices? Well, you can find out about active choices made by photographers here. You can find out about more active choices. You can see what I have to say about visual organization. You can see what I have to say about shutter speed and aperture, or creating focal points. And I don't have to link that because you're actually watching a video on that right now. But click on videos and see my other videos that are available. Um, and but that's kind of like just like an overall how I teach Photo One. Everything is building one thing on another. I don't just throw in random projects, except for kind of for those honor students, but everything is structured for a reason. Everything is building, everything is gaining in complexity. I have them take pictures at home for a reason. They definitely love their images so much more that they take them at home. They actually feel prouder of themselves because uh, my favorite Peloton instructor says, you know, confidence comes from accomplishments, not compliments. So basically, it's not just that they took a cool picture in school and someone's like, oh, I love that picture. That doesn't make them necessarily feel good. It's when they actually go home and put effort into it and take some pictures that reflect their own lives, and reflect the scene around them. That's what makes them feel good. That's what gives them ownership over their images. So if you have any questions, please just drop a comment in this video, and contact me, and I will try to answer them as best as possible. I don't know how many of you made it through this whole video, but that is how I structure my classes.